Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a truly massive, frankly explosive piece of history. We're going to be looking at the parallel rise, the violent clashes, and the eventual suppression of two gigantic labor movements back in the early 20th century. One's in Italy, and the other is over in Argentina. So let's trace their fascinating arc together, keeping things totally impartial as we go from that initial spark to a roaring flame and finally, to ashes.
Okay, let's dive into this by anchoring ourselves to a core question. How did early 20th century workers, who were armed initially with just their sheer numbers and their labor power, attempt to fight back against fully equipped state armies and rapidly rising fascist militias? The source material we're pulling from today paints a picture of an incredibly intense era where the streets and the factories literally became battlegrounds.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. The era of revolutionary ferment. 2. Argentine labor and FORA. 3. The rise of Italian fascism. 4. The Arditi del Popolo. And 5. State repression and decline. We'll be weaving back and forth between Europe and South America to compare these historical events, so buckle up.
Section 1. Era of Revolutionary Ferment. The Post-World War I Surge.
To really understand the spark of this era, you have to look at the post-World War I climate. All across the globe, workers began testing their collective strength. Now, they weren't necessarily trying to conquer political power entirely just yet, but they were demanding massive concessions. Just think about this staggering number. In September of 1920, 600,000 workers occupied factories across northern Italy. I mean, think about what that actually means for a second. Hundreds of thousands of individuals taking physical control of their workplaces in a highly coordinated action. It's wild. And you know what? This vibrant new militancy yielded some incredible, tangible results. By 1918, Italian workers and peasants had won significant concessions from the state. We're talking better wages, the 8-hour workday, and the official recognition of collective contracts. The momentum was just dizzying. For instance, in 1919 alone, an absolutely astounding 1,663 strikes swept across the Italian peninsula. Workers were organizing autonomously, setting up shop stewards and red leagues to impose a completely new discipline on social life. Section 2. Argentine labor and FORA. Organizing the South. Let's move to South America and see how this builds. So while Italy was boiling over post-WW1, Argentina was cultivating a massive, radicalized labor force of its own, heavily driven by European immigrants and native Argentines alike. Their primary vehicle was the Argentine Workers' Federation, or FOA, which was founded back in 1901. By 1905, they had actually embraced anarchist communism. From there, history tracks a really clear, dense escalation of conflict. You have a huge general strike in 1909, the devastating violence of the Semana Tragica in 1919, and eventually it all culminates in a severe crackdown after a military coup in 1930.
The sheer size of these South American movements was phenomenal. On May 1, 1904, 70,000 workers marched through the streets of the La Boca neighborhood in Buenos Aires. To put that into perspective, the entire population of the city at the time was only about 900,000, so having nearly 10% of a city's population marching in a single labor demonstration, that is astonishing. The historical record notes that this massive demonstration was actually prescribed by the government, and impartially speaking, we see it ended tragically with clashes that resulted in the death of a teenager named Juan Ocampo.
By 1909, the situation in Argentina escalated into a direct cycle of violence. During a May Day demonstration in Plaza Larea, Police Chief Ramon Falcón fired on workers, tragically killing several. The workers responded by declaring a massive 9-day general strike, and the hostility reached an absolute peak when a young anarchist named Simon Radowitzki assassinated Falcón with a bomb. In response to this, the state unleashed unprecedented repression. They declared martial law, raided union offices, and started deporting activists.
Section 3. Rise of Italian fascism, the counteroffensive.
Now we're transitioning back to Europe to observe what we can call the flame. See, the massive gains made by Italian workers didn't just go unanswered. Our sources detail how the state and capital reacted defensively and incredibly forcefully to the growing power of the labor movement. In April 1919, industrialists and landowners formed a holy alliance aimed at dismantling the labor unions and worker councils. But they couldn't do it alone, right? Capital turned to the armed enforcement of fascism, utilizing Benito Mussolini's elite force of 20,000 heavily armed shock troops. These squads were actively encouraged and even armed by the police and military to break the spirit of the labor revolt. The Italian anarchist Errico Malatesta offered this prophetic warning regarding those 600,000-strong factory occupations. He said, "If we do not carry on to the end, we will pay with tears of blood for the fears we now instill in the bourgeoisie." The key takeaway here is that every action has an equal, and often way more violent, reaction. The state's response was swift and brutal. Fascist squads began undertaking terrifying punitive expeditions, literally sweeping through rural villages like a scythe and destroying union offices in major cities.
Section 4. Verditi del Popolo. The workers strike back. Faced with overwhelming violence, the workers initiated a direct action response in June of 1921. To compensate for the shortcomings of official political parties, militants formed the world's first anti-fascist militia. Now, what's really interesting about this group is their striking visual identity: a skull surrounded by a laurel wreath, with a dagger in its teeth, carrying a motto, "A noi," meaning to us. This grassroots organization boasted roughly 20,000 members enlisted straight from factories, railways, and shipyards, and they ran on a strict military structure with squads, battalions, and even cycle squads for communication.
The historical texts share some incredible mini-narratives of this militia in action. One standout moment is the defense of Livorno in 1921. When the working-class neighborhood of Borgo dei Cappuccini came under attack by fascist squads, the entire community mobilized. The Arditi del Popolo successfully routed the fascists from the town, proving that organized, armed community defense could actually repel the shock troops. It's a stark historical reminder of how community mobilization can alter the balance of power, at least on a local level.
When you review the Italian timeline, it is astonishing how rapidly the historical situation escalated. Let's recap. 1918 brings peaceful labor concessions. 1919 sees massive strikes. By 1921, armed citizen militias are formed. And by 1922, the situation completely devolved into full-blown street warfare. Fascists were running public services with scabs and making themselves the armed masters of the streets. It all happened incredibly fast.
Section 5. State Repression and Decline, the Ashes.
This brings us to our final phase, the ashes. We really have to look at how these massive, formidable movements in both Italy and Argentina were ultimately dismantled. History shows us it was a lethal combination of overwhelming state force from the outside and fatal fractures from the inside. In Argentina, the state violence was devastating. A January 1919 metalworks strike resulted in the Semana Tragica, where police, military, and right-wing groups initiated pogroms in working-class neighborhoods, leaving up to 700 people dead. And just a year later, during the Patagonia Rebelde uprising, the Argentine army executed roughly 1,500 striking ranch hands.
But it wasn't just outside forces. Internal divisions proved fatal for both movements. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast happening at the time. In Argentina, the labor movement split between the militant Fora V, which advocated direct action, and the moderate Corda, which favored negotiation with employers. A very similar thing happened in Italy. The militant Arditi del Popolo were entirely undermined when the moderate Socialist Party decided to sign a pact of non-aggression with the fascists, completely isolating the workers' militia.
This dynamic of internal betrayal is captured perfectly by Italian union leader Matteotti. He actually ordered his members to withdraw from the anti-fascist militia, writing, "Stay at home. Do not respond to provocations. Even silence, even cowardice, are sometimes heroic." So the crucial point is that this stand-down order, alongside similar moves by other parties to form pure class-conscious squadrons, effectively decimated the unified resistance. It left them incredibly vulnerable to the fascist onslaught.
We'll end our explainer today on this provocative question. Looking at the sources, was the internal division of the labor movement just as responsible for their downfall as the external violence of the state armies and fascist militias? It's a lot to chew on. Ultimately, the 1930 military coup in Argentina and Mussolini's violent consolidation of power in Italy crushed these movements entirely, leaving behind a complex legacy of spark, flame, and ashes. I really hope this structured look through the historical record leaves you eager to dive deeper into this fascinating era. Thanks so much for joining me.